Hi everyone, it's Kathy and I am back with another Team Tiny video hop. I'll talk more about Team Tiny and what the hop entails a little bit later. But to start out, the theme for this month is tea or coffee. So I decided to use the to-go cup dies from CAS-ual Fridays and the Flower Garden stamp set from Pink Fresh Studio. So I wanted to do something a little bit different for my to-go coffee cup. So I consulted with the Google and I found this coffee cup, and that was where the inspiration came from for my card. Anyway, I stamped the Flower Garden stamp onto a piece of Tim Holtz Distress watercolor cardstock, and the ink I'm using is Catherine Pooler Aquatini ink. After I stamped the image, I grabbed the to-go cup die and I traced around it lightly with a pencil just so I would know where I was going to be cutting it out. I recently purchased a couple, so I might have purchased more than just a couple of Catherine Pooler ink pads because I had seen so much about them and how wonderful they are. And one of the properties of these ink pads is that you can actually watercolor with them. So I decided that I was going to do some faux watercoloring, I guess you could call this. So I grabbed a cup of clean water and a paintbrush and applied the water to the areas that I wanted the ink to kind of move around so it would fill in that particular part of the image. So while I finish up my faux watercoloring, I'll talk a little bit about Team Tiny. We're a group of smaller channels here on YouTube, and the purpose of this hop is to help our channels grow. We appreciate your support and hopping along with us, and this hop, like all of our hops, is a hashtag driven hop. So the easiest way to find everybody who's participating is just click on the hashtag either in my title or in the description box below. And once again, we have a couple of new people who have joined Team Tiny this month. So be sure to hop along, give the videos a thumbs up, comment on them, and if you're so inclined, please subscribe. We truly appreciate your support, and it's just been so much fun with participating in these hops. I'm confident that you'll find one more new to you YouTuber to subscribe to. Anyway, moving right along, after I was done with my faux watercoloring, I heat set it with my heat tool just to make sure that the cardstock was nice and dry before I ran it through my die cut machine with the to-go cup. And here's a trick: if you're heat setting something and your paper warps, flip it over to the other side and heat it from the other side, and that will help flatten it out a little bit. It won't totally flatten it out, but it will help. I did leave the stamp in my MISTI, and I lined the cardstock back up, and I did stamp it one more time just to get crisp lines again. Even though it really didn't blur, it's just that the cardstock is textured and I wanted to just kind of reinforce some of those stamped lines. After I ran that through my die cutting machine, I wanted to add some ink around the edges, so I used the same Aquatini ink with a little sponge and just kind of dragged the sponge around the edge just to give it a little bit more shape, I guess, for lack of a better word. I die cut a tiny little circle to go in the center, and I did go around the edge of that circle with a Copic marker just so that there would be a little bit of a border around that. Then I moved on to working on my background. So I pulled out this stripes stencil that I've had in my stash for quite some time, and on a piece of Neenah Classic Crest cardstock in Solar White, I just stenciled the stripes using Grout Gray ink from My Favorite Things, and I used a makeup blending brush for that. And the Grout Gray ink is really, really very light. So I did quite a few passes with that just to make sure that it showed up. I wanted it to be there, but I wanted it to be really very subtle, which is why I chose the Grout Gray ink. Then I decided to stamp on top of those stripes with the Flower Garden stamp. And again, I used it with the Grout Gray ink. And I did stamp it, I only show that I stamped it twice, I think, but I did stamp it 3 times just to make sure that it actually showed up. Again, a very, very light ink. And I'm really happy with how the background turned out because it is really very subtle. So after I was done with that, I was kind of playing around with placement and decided that I needed to have another coffee cup. So I ran the to-go cup die through my die cut machine with a piece of Kraft cardstock, and then there's also a, what are those things called? Koozies? There's also a die for a koozie. So since I had so much left over on the watercolor panel, I die cut a koozie from the watercolor panel and did the same thing, just applied a wet paintbrush to the areas where I wanted the ink to bleed. And then to add a little bit of shape to the Kraft colored coffee cup, I used my Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink just to ink those edges a little bit. I used a sentiment stamp from Whimsy to stamp inside the circle, and in hindsight, I kind of wish I would have just left the circle plain, but you know, it's done, and I was too lazy just to cut out another circle, so I just kept going. Next, it was time to start putting my coffee cups together and to adhere the lids, which, by the way, I just die cut those from the Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. And I used liquid glue. Now, as you all know, if you've ever been here before, liquid glue typically is not my friend. And of course, I got it all over my craft mat and all over my hands, but eventually I got the stuff to stick. I did run my little koozie for the Kraft colored coffee cup through a paper crimper just so that it would have that crimped look to it. And I did the same thing just to add a little bit more shape to the koozie. I just dragged ink on a sponge around the edges of that. I used my tape runner to adhere the background, which I had run through my die cut machine with a stitched rectangle die, and adhered that to the front of a side folding A2 size Kraft note card. I adhered the Kraft colored coffee cup with my tape runner, and then I put a whole bunch of foam tape on the back of the flowered coffee cup and put that into place. And to finish it up, I thought it could go for a couple of latte colored sequins just to bring out a little bit more of that Kraft. So I adhered those down with my liquid glue, and that's it. That finishes up my card. Thank you so much for joining me today. Don't forget to click on the hashtag so you can follow everybody else with the Team Tiny video hop. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.